Hi, all. This is Ann Lund, and I'm coming from you with the next podcast here at the Eye Opener Society, being presented by my own blog and podcast, Haunted and Waiting. You can find me on Facebook, you can find me on TikTok, you can find me, of course, here on the Eye Opener Society on either BitChute or YouTube. And I can also be found on my blog, which is called hauntedandwaiting.blog. First of all, let's introduce today's topic, which is the filter. So I've had a lot of people ask me about the filter and explain it in a way that they can understand. Some people get it and some people don't, but it is very prevalent pretty much in everything. It exists in how you basically see the world around you, sometimes not so truthfully. So let me get into the topic of today, which again is the filter. And the title of this podcast is basically the filter, why we can't prove ghosts exist, even if they're real. Okay. So what if the reason we can't prove ghosts exist is not because they don't actually exist, but because we're trained not to see them? Think about that. What if the world isn't lacking evidence? What if there's enough evidence out there, but we're failing to see it because we are filtering out that evidence? So the idea of the filter isn't everything, like I said. Okay, it's a concept in psychology called reality tunnel or the reality tunnel. And it suggests that every single one of us sees the world through a filter that's built by our beliefs, our upbringing, and what we've been taught is real. Can come through religion, can come through school, can come through your friends, can come through your family. And from the moment we're very young, we're basically told this when it comes to ghosts in most circumstances. Ghosts aren't real. Don't believe everything you see. And there's always a logical explanation. I love that one. There's always a logical explanation. Although with that one, a lot of times logical omits the fact that maybe logical is that they actually do exist. And over the years, something happens very slowly. Okay, we stop trusting in our own perceptions. We ignore that shadow in the corner that we kind of see when we're not paying attention. We explain away those footsteps we hear upstairs. We dismiss that feeling that you're being watched, someone's standing over your shoulder. We dismiss it not because we say, hey, we're not going to pay attention to it, but we dismiss it because of the filter. Okay, the filter logically, or I should say, in its own sense, filters the information, makes us ignore it. I'm going to tell you my own personal story. It was interesting, but when I was young, I grew up in a haunted house. If you're curious to read about that, you can go to my blog, hauntedandwaiting.blog, read up it's a free book that I'm posting there called My Bronx Haunting. And I write about some of the experiences I had there. But in this particular house in the city, it was only myself and my sister-in-law who believed the house was haunted. We saw things, we experienced things, okay? As well as some of the friends that we had, street kids that would come into the neighborhood. Come into the house from the neighborhood that would come to my house and see things. But other than that, majority of my family, I would say 80% of my family did not believe the house was haunted. I had one friend, I'm going to call him T, okay? He was at my house one day. We were, I want to say, about 10 years old. And it was just him and I sitting in our living room. And at that time, it's an old Bronx house. There were radiators in every room, okay? A pre-war house. And over the radiators, if any of you live in an old house, there was something called a radiator cover. Okay, so it's a wooden box that fit over the radiator so that you wouldn't get burned if you happened to touch it. For whatever reason, and he was a believer, okay, he was one of my friends that believed, when he would come into my house, this radiator cover would shake. It would shake on its own and it would go, it would just shake. And he would look at it and he'd get scared and he'd run out. He ran out of our house many times because of this. Now, I had mentioned this to the adults in the house at the time, and they dismissed it. Well, we did live near a train. The train was a block away. Maybe the vibration from the train is doing it. Okay, fine. Then how come it only happens when T is in the house and no other time? So they couldn't explain it. So there were times when T was in my house and my whole family was there, and the radiator would do this, and nobody seemed to notice it but T and myself. We instantly would notice it. And of course, I'm going to say, once we brought it up to everybody's attention, it would just stop as if whatever was making it shake was making it stop the same way. But we heard it, nobody else heard it because they had filtered out that situation. They had filtered out that it was moving. Why did they filter it out? Because radiators don't move on their own. So it was filtered. So it's a perfect example of a filter. Okay. Um, and there's also this idea of, taboo and social conditioning, right? So let's be honest, believing in ghosts, although it's a little bit more mainstream, is still very taboo. Even today, if you tell someone, hey, I saw this, I heard that, you're immediately met with, it's almost immediate. You were tired. It was your imagination. There's a rational explanation, and I love that one because they always try to figure that one out. And if they can't come up with a rational explanation, it always defaults to you were tired, it was your imagination. Or maybe even you're making it up. That's the one I can't stand. But here's the deeper question. How many experiences are dismissed before they're actually even explored, like my radiator cover? Okay, psychology shows us that our brains are wired with these biases. Okay, so we interpret the world in ways that confirm what we already believe. For instance, radiators don't move on their own. So if you believe in ghosts, if you believe that ghosts aren't real, your brain will literally work to disprove your own experience over and over and over again. When I was in Gettysburg, they had given us, there was this tour that we had done, and they'd given us this bag with all these ghost hunting equipments. And before we went around the house, it was called the Murder House, actually, to explore the house. The people throwing the tour showed us videos, and in these videos were over and over and over and over examples of times when a light would go off on its own or something would fall off a desk, and everybody in the room, I should say, nobody in the room picked up on it, didn't even notice it because of that filter. So let's talk about the scientific method and the paranormal. And we gotta love the materialists, right? Gotta love them. We're gonna talk about science. Science relies on something incredibly powerful. It's called the scientific method. We all know it, right? When you went to school, seventh grade science, right? You observe something, you measure it. If you can repeat it with controlled conditions, then you can prove it. Here's the problem, okay? Ghosts don't follow rules. We know that. They don't show up on command. You can't just take a ghost and tell them, here, we're going to do an experiment on you. They don't repeat on cue. They don't perform in controlled environments. And because of that, science will automatically dismiss it. The other thing is, if you really think about it, when you do a scientific experiment, you can include all the variables. You remove variables to make sure that it wasn't a cause and effect that a variable created. But what if there are variables that we just don't know of yet, that science hasn't uncovered yet? Such as ESP. We can't prove it, but what if that's a variable? Maybe a person has to have a certain level of sensitivity to these things to do an experiment. So it's flawed just in its very own method, the scientific experiment. The scientific community doesn't understand that those things cannot be proven, okay? So, and the fact that scientific consensus is that there's no reliable evidence that ghosts exist, and many experiences are explained through perceptual errors or environmental factors or the brain misinterpreting sensory input. So, for instance, the radiator is moving because of the train. They don't pay attention to the fact it doesn't always do that, and it only did it when T was in the room. Okay, so things like sleep paralysis, hallucinations, pareidolias, which is seeing faces in things that maybe represent a spirit. Okay, are this unintentional blindness. Okay, going back to the radiator covers, how nobody else seemed to notice the radiators but me and my friend. That's unintentional blindness. Also, when we were in Gettysburg, the fact that nobody saw a flashlight flickering in the corner of the room, again, unintentional blindness because it's not something that should be happening, so you don't see it. Your brain literally begins filling in gaps. So science says it's not a ghost, it's your brain. But what if that's only part of the story? So the materialists believe in this big filter, right? There's a philosophy behind modern science called materialism. Okay, basically says only physical things exist. If you can't measure it, if you can't detect it, it doesn't, or if it doesn't interact with physical matter, it doesn't exist. Guess what? Ghosts do not fit that model either. Okay, so they're dismissed. Not necessarily because they've been disproven, but because they don't fit that framework. Some versions of this thinking, like eliminative materialism go even further, suggesting that things we experience might not even exist if they can't be explained biologically. In other words, if science can't explain it, it gets filtered out. Okay. So it's not like you're trying to ignore it, your brain automatically ignores it. But what if the filter works both ways? Here's where it gets interesting. Science says we misinterpret reality. But what if sometimes reality is being misinterpreted by science itself? Even some physicists have questioned whether materialism can fully explain consciousness or reality at all. So now we're left with something unsettling. Two filters, right? One that filters out proof of ghosts and one that filters in logical explanations. And somewhere in between, I feel, is the truth, right? So you do have those people that everything is a haunting. Okay, so it works both ways. So let's talk about real cases because that's what I love, where the filter may have applied. Okay. So there's a situation that happened in England in 1977. I will have it in my blog, the link you can read up on it yourself, but it's called the Enfield Poltergeist. And there was a family that reported seeing objects moving, voices, physical disturbances, and the classic definition of a haunted house, so to speak. Some say it was paranormal, and others say that it was just a hoax or like a psychological trick on the brain. But here's the key. Some events were witnessed by multiple people, yet still dismissed. Okay, so multiple people are having these experiences, but it was still dismissed. The scientists dismissed it. You can read more about that on my blog. Okay. And again, it's similar to the Amityville horror situation in 1975. Okay. One of the most famous hauntings here in the United States. Okay. With the Lutz family. Okay. Where they heard voices, they heard apparitions, violent paranormal activity. Skeptics again called it a hoax. Again, but some supporters were arguing that parts were exaggerated or the entire case filtered out because it didn't fit the scientific explanation. But again, more than one person experienced the same thing at the same time. So unless it was a mass hoax, that's another perfect example. Sleep paralysis. Anybody out there have that? Thank goodness I do not have sleep paralysis, but thousands of people across cultures do have sleep paralysis. My son is one of them, where they report seeing dark figures or pressure on the chest or presence in the room. Science says sleep paralysis and hallucinations can cause that, right? But here's the twist. Why do so many people describe the exact same shadowy figure across cultures, across countries? Is it the brain? Really? Are the brains communicating with each other across the sea? Or are we filtering the same experience through different explanations? So I'm going to add a link there as well about sleep paralysis. So if you experience sleep paralysis and you want a little bit more than the scientific explanation, please go there and read up. Okay. So in closing, the next time your dog stares into the dark, okay, or your cat leaps for no reason, or you hear something you can't explain, or maybe see something through the corner of your eye, ask yourself, did nothing happen? Or did you just filter? Did you just decide not to pay attention to it, not to research the house you live in, not to look into a situation? Okay. So maybe ghosts don't need proof. Maybe, there was a time when we didn't realize gravity was a thing, right? Until we could prove it. Could be the same thing. So anyway, again, thanks for listening. And if you have a chance, please hop on over to the Eye Opener Society. Some of the other podcasts are amazing. Alternative realities. We talk about things a lot of people don't like to talk about, a lot of raw stuff. And of course, you can also find me on my blog, hauntedandreading.blog, as well as on Facebook, same name, as well as on TikTok, same name. Wish you all well. And until next time, this is Ann Lund.